What's up, everyone? So recently, the Tor project, or put it more accurately, a few developers working there made a decision that was, to say the least, not very okay. It caught the attention of a lot of privacy advocates and security professionals and darknet users, criminals, non-criminals alike. The ones that I talked to were fairly surprised and some were concerned. To be blunt, the Tor project, in the move that it made, or these developers made, gave off the appearance that it abandoned one of its most important privacy protections. And if you ask, well, okay, well, they must have had a reason, right? Like, well, it wasn't because the feature was broken, and it wasn't because it caused some instability or conflicted with something that was absolutely vital. They removed it simply because they wanted to and they could. Now, this month, with the release of Tor Browser version 14.5, developers permanently removed the operating system spoofing feature. This feature was designed to try and make every Tor user look identical in the HTTP headers, which is a foundational part of the Tor privacy model in general. And now it's gone. So how did this actually happen? Well, historically, the Tor browser spoofed your operating system in the HTTP headers. So everyone looked like they were on Windows, regardless of whether they were on Mac OS or Linux or anything else. And this was absolutely intentional. It made you part of the crowd. It made you have camouflage. It reduced the identifiable traits and ensured that users blended in together in the uniformity of a crowd. So now you might be thinking, well, it's just one setting, right? Like, how could that really matter at all? And the answer is it does matter, and I think it matters a lot. And maybe that's not the case, but this is just my opinion. So think about trying to identify a single person out of the entire world. Like, if all you know is that they're a human being, that's 1 out of 8 billion. But then I tell you, say, for example, the target is a man. So you instantly cut that pool in half, right? Now, let's say he lives in the United States. So now you're down to like 165 million or something. He lives in New Mexico, and that brings it to like 1 million. And, then we say, okay, he's in his 50s. And now he's one of like 130,000. He has one biological child, 32,000. Master's degree or higher, roughly 6,500. He works in education, 500. He has a secondary source of income, maybe 150. And finally, if he recently made a major life change following a health issue, you're down to roughly a dozen people or so. And that's the power of metadata. It's no joke, which is why it's a serious thing. It's taken seriously. Just, 8 vague details narrowed down 8 billion people to 12. That's a 99.99999, you get a reduction. On average, each attribute reduced the pool by 84.2%. So if you want another perspective, imagine the distance from the Earth to the sun represents the global population, right? So it's 93 million miles total, that distance. Then the final group of candidates would occupy just 0.0 inches of that. That's, with the thickness of a credit card. So when we talk about reducing entropy in the Tor browser, we're talking about eliminating tiny clues that can be used to identify, which is valid. That's important. And OS spoofing used to be one of those shields. The change didn't happen immediately or all at once. It was kind of a gradual thing. It was definitely intentional, and it was backed by rationalizations that, I don't agree with. Let's see if you do. So back in October of 2024, the Tor browser 14.0 was actually released. Developer Thornton opened issue 43170, stating,
"Privacy-resist fingerprinting spoofos in user agent header should be false in Tor browser 14+. The original intent of 42,647 was that we turn off spoofing OS, and ESR changes are the perfect time to do it."
despite suggestions that users should have the option to keep this feature, which is an issue that some other developer raised, who said
The intent was to let an opt-in for users.
Thornton explicitly shut down that idea when he said,
First, we are meant to discourage users from changing settings in about config, and a non-advertised pref is not going to do it, especially as opt-in to turn it off. Might as well do nothing.
he didn't stop there, he continued on.
Second, this is a compatibility issue with real-world consequences and no entropy changes in safer standard, so it's a no-brainer. Third, by adding a switch, you are allowing entropy to increase, which is antithetical to the mission. Fourth, this has been baked into Mulvad Browser for 6 months or more. Fifth, and finally, the only question remaining was if we wanted to do anything in safest mode, i.e. revert to spoofing the OS. But in my opinion, it's not worth it. In safest mode, the amount of entropy is already reduced by 95%. No JavaScript.
So, I mean, you can see, like, this was a deliberate design shift, driven by the belief that user control introduces too much variability, essentially, which the developers framed as a threat to consistency. So discouraging users from changing, about config preferences due to its non-advertised status, in no way is that like some kind of security argument. But I would say it's an authoritarian one, like one that I could definitely hear Microsoft making. The spoofing feature didn't introduce fingerprinting risk. Instead, it mitigated it in large part. It created uniformity among HTTP headers when JavaScript was actually disabled, which, keep in mind, is a critical condition in things like high-threat environments and something that essentially anyone who knows anything does when they actually use Tor. Removing the feature definitely doesn't align anything. It exposes users. And the problem wasn't that the setting created entropy. It was that some developers, decided entropy control itself should no longer be available to users. And I'm sorry, man, it's just not a simplification. In effect, the project moved from safeguarding edge case anonymity to enforcing a lowest common denominator kind of experience that just happens to be easier to test. Like, their logic effectively says that because spoofing can't fool everything, it shouldn't fool anything. And I'm sorry, man, I disagree with that. That's not threat modeling, at all. In fact, to me, it sounds a lot like defeatism in disguise, disguised as engineering. And in April of 2025, with the release of Tor Browser 14.5, developer Morgan submitted issue 43189, which removed the entire OS spoofing codebase, where he said,
with 43,170, we are no longer spoofing user agents in any of our browsers. We can therefore remove the relevant machinery from Firefox altogether.
Now, even experienced users were stripped of the option to be able to decide what they want to do. There was absolutely no opt-in, no fallback, or kind of edge case support, which is, again, something that they're kind of known for. So this was done despite warnings from more security-conscious contributors like this one.
Before merge, I think we should consider keeping that preference to allow user to opt in or make it default in safest mode to defend passive fingerprinting. My concern is passive fingerprinting in case of server seizure. The server logs can reveal more information about the user to the adversary.
Now, they said that there was a mismatch between JavaScript and HTTP headers. And instead of fixing the issue or trying to fix the issue, the JavaScript detection or maintaining spoofing where JavaScript is disabled, they just killed the whole thing, and that still worked. Like, they claimed the entropy impact was negligible, where Pierre had said
1 million total users, 600,000 Windows, 200,000 Linux, 200,000 macOS, 1.37 bits of entropy. It isn't much at all.
But that doesn't make sense because it assumes that all users are part of this simple kind of split, right? 60% Windows, 20% Linux, 20% Mac OS. And that gives you 3 groups, which means roughly 1.58 bits of entropy, or in Pierce's estimate, 1.37 bits. But here's the actual issue. That number only works if you're actually in one of those 3 groups. If you're not, like, for example, if you're using something uncommon, like Qubes or OpenBSD, you're not part of the average. You're part of an outliner. And those outliners, those are the things that are easy to spot. So if only 0.1% of Tor users are on Qubes, for example, then spotting someone using Qubes gives you almost 10 bits of entropy. That means you're more unique. That means you're more distinguishable, right? And far easier to track across things like sessions or services. And that's a really big fingerprint to have. So when Pierce says, it isn't all that much, he's only talking about the most generic of users. If you're running a hardened OS specifically to avoid being profiled, this change just made you stick out like a flare in the dark, And this is exactly backwards from how privacy tools should actually work. The users who are doing things right, like disabling JavaScript, running secure systems, reducing browser, surface attack area, are now actually punished with more exposure because someone else decided they wanted simplicity. They also tried to invoke HTTPS, where they said
it's useful only when using a proxy. For Firefox or Mullavid browser doesn't make sense, as an actor that eavesdrops clear text HTTP requests will likely see TCP as well, and will be likely able to detect your OS anyway.
However, HTTPS didn't prevent server-side logs from capturing user agent strings. If a hidden service is seized or surveilled, OS data in those logs becomes a target vector. Like the fact that the passive TCP OS fingerprinting exists doesn't justify voluntarily exposing, the operating system in headers. And Tor Browser already warns users before they access the about config. Like the devs chose to remove compatibility because some users might misuse it. Mind you, if, some people did misuse it, they would be the ones who actually pay the ultimate price, not some random developer that, volunteers or gets paid for the Tor project. I have no idea, by the way, which one it is. I really don't care at the end of the day. I care about the decisions that are made with stuff like this. Now, they also claim spoofing causes occasional site breakage, but instead of isolating those breakages or letting users toggle behavior, they just stripped it out. And yes, Mullavid browser is also affected too. We get to the question of what does this actually mean for the users? If you're running JavaScript, then, which shouldn't be, but your operating system is now being revealed in 2 separate ways. First, through your HTTP headers, and second, through what JavaScript APIs can detect about your environment. Now, these 2 data points now match up. And this means your browser sends a consistent fingerprint that can be used to track your access, across all these different websites, even if you are using Tor. For example, the navigator user agent string in JavaScript might say you're on Linux. And now the HTTP header will also confirm that, whereas before that the header would say that you were in Windows. And no matter what OS you were actually using, it would say that. That mismatch used to act as noise, if you will. Basically like a intentional distortion to confuse fingerprinting scripts. But now that both vectors line up, the fingerprint becomes more precise. And any site or surveillance system that sees both gets a stronger signal about who you actually are. So in technical terms, this removes an important layer of obfuscation. Fingerprinting is basically about correlation. Like the example that we gave before. The more unique identifiers, the better for your adversaries, their like abilities to figure out who you actually are. And, if the server sees that you're using Linux specific fonts and now knows those details are, stable from one site to the next, you become easier to recognize and track, as it were, even if you're behind Tor. So these traits accumulate just like our, unique identifiers that we looked at initially and make you stand out. And that's the core of the issue. Every removed layer of spoofing sharpens your adversary's tools. And if you're using the safest mode with JavaScript disabled, good job, first off, but your browser should be leaking the least amount of data possible in that case. And that used to be the entire point of that mode, right? Disabling JavaScript removes a ton of attack surface, but it makes it so that there's things like no canvas fingerprinting, no hardware enumeration, no JavaScript level OS detection. In that state, the HTTP header was one of the only remaining ways your browser could accidentally identify you. Previously, operating system spoofing covered this and made sure that even in the safest mode, your user agent header always said Windows, regardless of what system you were actually using. And this meant users on Linux, Qubes, or BSD didn't stand out from the rest of the crowd. That fallback is gone. The Tor browser no longer spoofs the OS in the user agent string at all. So when you disable JavaScript and think you're covered, you're actually not. The OS fingerprint leaks through your headers. Any seized hidden service can use those logs to help narrow down who was actually connecting to it. So, for example, if you were one of the 0.1 of users on Qubes OS, like me, and think you're using, safest mode and, you're anonymous, the HTTP headers alone outs you to some degree. It doesn't matter that your screen resolution is hidden or that your, JavaScript fingerprint is blank. Your operating system is already enough to make you stand out. And that used to be covered. It isn't anymore. And pretending that, safest mode still protects against stuff like passive fingerprinting is now just security theater by these developers. So if you use a rare operating system, you're fairly uniquely exposed. So then we get to mitigation options. So all this exists and it sucks, but what can we do about it? And the answer to that is going to be to use Tails or Whonix, right? If you want, stay on, Tor Browser 14.0 and re-enable spoofing manually via the about config. Disable JavaScript or use hardened browsers through Tor routing with, custom anti-fingerprint setups. Now, let's not pretend that these are good options, right? The feature removal definitely was not a bug fix or a necessary trade-off in any way. It was a nonsensical thing that was done. Developers made it clear that they don't trust you with the tools that you depend on. Now, you might be thinking, hold on a minute, Sam. You just said that, if I use a rare operating system like Qubes or BSD, I'm uniquely exposed. But then you told us to use Tails or Whonix, which are also niche systems. Isn't that the same problem? That would be a great question. But the key difference is that Tails and Whonix aren't just rare operating systems. They are privacy hardened systems designed to isolate your base operating system from your identity and your network traffic, right? They were purpose built for anonymity. And, when used correctly, they act as great buffers, shielding your actual host machine and environment from being exposed at all. Now, Tails runs entirely from RAM. So, it doesn't touch your disk. It doesn't, store logs. It's amnesic. It routes everything through Tor by default. And Whonix, credit to it, goes even further. Of course, it doesn't matter if you have malware on your system. If you have Windows and you're running Whonix and you have malware, you're going to screw it anyways. But that's a kind of a different thing that we'll get into another time. But with Whonix, it goes even further because it compartmentalizes your activity into 2 VMs, one to handle Tor routing and one for everything else. So even if the browser does leak, like, that it's running on Linux, let's say, that doesn't necessarily expose anything about your actual real system or environment. Now, contrast that with Qubes, Arch, or OpenBSD. With those, while those are really great security operating systems, they don't necessarily isolate your browser as well. If Tor Browser leaks, that, say you're running on Qubes and you're one of those, only Qubes users on Tor, then you're exposed because that fingerprint, which is your rare OS, leads directly back to you. And the problem at that point isn't just running a rare OS. The problem is running a rare OS in a way that allows it to be fingerprinted by the browser. If you're using Whonix or Tails, that fingerprint is contained within an isolated system. But if you're using a general purpose operating system directly and Tor Browser leaks it, that's where the risk spikes. So if you care about privacy, then update your threat model accordingly, because some lone wolf devs maintaining the Tor browser, clearly don't share the same threat model that you do. Also, let them know through social media. I, for one, would love to see this feature back. In any case, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.